Hey everybody, Joanna here. Today I'm going to be talking about book formats. And I know this is not an original topic on BookTube, but I've been watching some videos discussing this topic. The most recent one I saw was on the channel Criminale, and I decided I wanted to weigh in because the more I think about book formats, the more I realize how my thoughts have evolved over time on this topic. So I'm going to be sharing some of those thoughts that I've been having recently about the topic, as well as a study that I just randomly pulled today on the topic because I was curious, and tying it or relating it to what I've heard on BookTube. And I'll also be sharing my own personal experiences related to this topic later in the video in case you're interested. But the formats I'll be discussing include the mass market paperback. And so I'm with the generation of readers who grew up with this being most widely available. And so I think there's a nostalgia factor here. Many people love the compact size of this. And comparing that to the trade paperback. Now, I didn't even realize there was such a distinction between mass market paperback and trade paperback until recent years and hearing about people talking about the difference on BookTube. And from what I've heard from most of the videos I've seen, I've heard people love the mass market paperback for the compact size. A lot of vintage titles are in mass market paperback. There's some appeal about that. And yet, many people prefer the trade paperback because there's the floppy factor. People talk about that all the time, floppy factor. And there are obviously illustrations in this one. I'm looking forward to reading this. I haven't read this yet. This is George R. R. Martin's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Anyway, you could lay it flat. And that's something that you really can't do with the mass market paperback. You have to use both hands to open it. It'd be very difficult otherwise. And you don't have to worry about breaking the spine too, because it lays flat. You could see it a lot easier, see all the print. Whereas even with the holding open the mass market paperback, it's a bit of a struggle to get your eyes in there towards the spine. And there's a shadow that's created. It's kind of challenging in my opinion. And the font size, I think, is a little easier to read. It's a little more spaced out in the trade paperback versus the mass market paperback. So there are some advantages and disadvantages there between these two formats. But a third option that I'll be talking about, e-reading. I did get this for Christmas, this last Christmas. And obviously there are several advantages here. I did do a video about my experience with the Kindle if you want to check it out. But also audiobooks. And I also have a video on my experience with audiobooks that I did a couple years ago. So watch that at your own risk. It's an older video. But I don't think my thoughts on audiobooks have changed much since doing that video. And I'm just going to be talking about that very briefly here in this video. But as I said, I did find a research study that talked about reading digitally and the affordances it allows readers. So this was a qualitative study, and anytime you have qualitative research, you're usually dealing with a small sample size. So in this case, we have 12 participants who are leisure readers, and they studied these readers' reports of how they perceived affordances provided to them through reading either on ebook or audiobook. So this was through the analytical framework of affordance theory. Anytime you have qualitative research, usually you're using some kind of analytical or theoretical framework. And I'll go ahead and post the definition of affordance theory on the screen. But this has to do with the relationship between the object's properties or the features, for example, of the ebook and the person's capabilities. But anyhow, one of the things that I found really interesting about what the participants reported in this study was what they said about e-reading and how similar it was to things I've heard on BookTube and my own experience. The advantages of the low weight, the small size, the fact that it's very compact. One thing that I didn't bring up here, the possibility of bringing a whole library along. So if you pack this on a trip, you could bring several books with you in this small device. Versus, even though we talked about the compact nature of the mass market paperback, this is only one book. So there are advantages to that. And one thing they also said about the e-reader that I think is worth noting is what they said about the people adjusting to ebooks. Because one thing I've noticed about people when it comes to e-readers, myself included, is I feel like people who grew up with paperbacks, there's such a nostalgia factor. There's also a resistance as a result of that to switch to reading an e-reader. Maybe like a strong resistance. But one thing that they said, the participants said, the ones who did the most e-reading, they are reported having a long history of tablet reading. So they also indicated that it takes some time to understand the meaning of the affordances of the tablets. And they also said that this is in line with the operation of body schema identified in research on embodied reading. In other words, our brains are programmed into thinking of reading as a certain experience. And so when we have such an association of holding a book as the experience of reading versus holding a digital device, there could be a clash in our minds, and it could take time, like with neuroplasticity, to start to see the benefits or to get adjusted to it. Maybe less time for some people than others. Who knows? Maybe some people will never get adjusted to ebooks. I can say that my grandmother in law does read on a Kindle, and she seems to have no problem with it. She reads exclusively on a Kindle. And I think it also is an advantage when you're growing older and your eyesight starts to fail, because I've noticed that she reads her Kindle ebooks with a huge font size, like 1 to 2 sentences a page, and for some reason, she just flows through books very easily that way. So it can take some time to get used to it. Like I said, she will not read books any other way now. And when it comes to that tactile experience, I have heard a lot of people talk about that, the feel of the book, or if you're Leslie from the Nerdy Narrative, the smell of the book, that there's something about that sensory experience that adds to the reading experience. I've heard so many people talk about that. And something that I think about when I hear people talk about that is the emotional factor being reinforced by the sensory experience. So, one thing that I thought about is how when you open a book or you get a book for the first time and you see the book, and there might be emotions that come up in you when you see the cover, and there's the experience of opening a book for the first time, reading the opening line at the same time as you're seeing the words with your eyes, at the same time as you're feeling the book in your hands. There's got to be some kind of combination of emotions that is compounded by multiple sensory things happening at the same time. And yet, whenever we read a book, whether it's a physical book or a digital book, whatever it is, I would think that the most ideal experience is that when we're reading the book, when we're in the thick of the book, we're so lost in the experience that we forget we're reading, right? We want to disappear. I want to disappear when I read. I don't know about you all, but I want to be so immersed in the story that I forget I'm a person named Joanna who's sitting here holding an object called a book, or even holding an object called a Kindle, reading these things called words on a page. I just want to be in Westeros. I'm reading A Dance with Dragons right now. However, when I finished that story, I could see also a combination of emotions emerging. When you get to the final line in the book, the end of the story, and you close the book and you feel the book, you hear the sound of the book close, while at the same time being suspended by whatever emotion the book evoked in you. I think that also has to be a combination of emotions that are adding to your experience. So there probably is something about the tactile experience when you start that journey with the book and when you finish the book. And I had never thought about that before until recently. And this also gets into books as symbols, because a lot of people like to collect books. I'll talk about my experience with that a little bit later. But there's probably got to be something, or I think there's something to seeing the book on your shelf and knowing that that's a journey that you went on. If I see this book on my shelf, it's a reminder to me, a symbol of a journey that I took and a journey that I could take again if I want to pull that book down. Or if it's a book I haven't read yet, it's a journey that I will take someday. Of course, this is different with the library, which we'll get to. One particular study that was referred to in the discussion section talked about a study in which the researchers compared long form literary reading for readers who read on Kindle versus on paper. And they found that overall comprehension was comparable, but at the same time, they found that navigating across linear progress and remembering the order and understanding temporalities and narratives is easier on paper than on screen. And I can see why, honestly. So, like, for example, if I'm reading The Fellowship of the Ring, then I get to the section with Tom Bombadil. If I'm reading the physical object, I can kind of see that this is a third of the way through the book. And my mind might imprint that memory, even my subconscious mind. So then, if I were asked, when did Tom Bombadil, when did that section happen? I could kind of bring up, oh, that's about a third of the way through the book. That's probably not exact, by the way. Whereas if I read it on e-reader and I was asked how far into the story that happened, it might be a little bit less clear. So I could see how that would be the case if you have that visual cue as far as when things happen, the order of things that happen, and when it happens. And also, I have to say, as a fantasy reader, and I did mention this in my Kindle video, I do find it easier to flip back to the map when I have the physical copy versus on Kindle. And I had many comments in which people said, well, you could just bookmark the map. And yes, I know I could do that. But for whatever reason, I just find it more of a hassle. I find it so much easier to just flip back in a paperback. So I don't know. And I haven't even talked about hardbacks. I'm sorry. That's just not part of this discussion, I guess. But either way, it's just easier to flip back with paper. And by the way, there were a couple of studies that were mentioned in which the researchers found reading comprehension better on paper than on Kindle, but I'm not sure about that. I'd have to look that up more. And as far as audiobooks, what I found interesting, now keep in mind, these are people who are leisure readers. I think most of BookTube would be considered leisure reading, but I don't know. It depends on the person, I guess, and what your goal is out of a book. They found that the people in the study did find audiobooks to be more peripheral reading, is what they called it, that they didn't consider audiobook reading as something as easy to handle or to scroll back through, and their attention was not as tuned in to audiobooks. Now, again, small sample size. I think people vary as far as this is concerned. I think a lot of that has to do with working memory in the brain. That's my theory behind that. And I think that's especially hard with fantasy when you're trying to keep in mind fantasy character names and new places and objects and magic, so many different things to keep in mind at one time. So that takes a lot of work when you're just working on an audiobook for some people. Again, I think people vary when it comes to this skill, but they did enjoy the advantages that many people enjoy with audiobooks, like being able to do different tasks at the same time as listening to an audiobook. Another drawback with audiobooks was reading speed. Many talked about how it took longer to listen to an audiobook. Now, keep in mind that these participants didn't talk about immersion reading, which I know a lot of people do here in BookTube, which is to listen and read visually at the same time. So they didn't do that. That could affect things. I did find one other research study that I should go ahead and mention, in which they found that with reading speed, they tested reading speed visually versus reading speed through audiobooks when you can change the speed on an audiobook. And they did find that you can consume more words per minute when you're listening to an audiobook versus reading visually, but not that much faster. So if you're flipping up to 3 times speed and it's way faster than you can actually visually read, you're probably not comprehending as much as you think you are, but you can increase the audiobook speed a little bit faster than your normal visual reading speed, and that can work. But again, I don't really know about immersion reading. I haven't looked up that topic. I have to say, I relate from my own personal experience. There was a time when I never would have dreamed of getting a Kindle or reading an ebook. That was not something I would ever consider. And it was only in recent years after reading so much that I realized my eyes were hurting and I was starting to discover the convenience of ebooks, that I ended up investing, or actually got my husband to buy me a Kindle for Christmas. And the other thing too with audiobooks, my thoughts have evolved on that, as I mentioned in my Evolving Thoughts on Audiobooks video. And I do think BookTube has been responsible for my open mindedness to both formats, quite honestly. And it's nice to have a variety of formats available. It does maximize your reading time, I would say. It certainly has for me. Now, one other thing I want to mention here is the library, because I am somebody who used to use the library exclusively when it came to reading. Now, way further back, I'll rewind even further. I did used to collect books when I was much younger. And then I got to a point where my books were so beat up, I didn't think I'd ever reread them. And I got rid of a ton of them. I wanted to be more minimal with moving and everything. And so I got rid of a lot of books over the years. And then I started using the library, and I loved using the library, especially when I first started getting back into reading, because I didn't want to invest a lot of money into reading when it wasn't a primary habit in my life or a primary thing in my life as much as I wanted it to be. And I also wanted to save money and save space, especially if I didn't know my reading taste at the time. Because at the time when I was getting back into reading, I still wasn't totally sure about what types of fantasy books, for example, that I would love. So it was helpful to use the library, and it had so many advantages of saving money. And even though I didn't have the symbol of the book on my shelf, I had the symbol of space showing me how much money I was saving, and I found that rewarding. But what changed for me when it came to the library were 2 things. One was that I moved. So I used to live much closer to my local library, and now my local library is not as local as it used to be. And the second thing is I found that through the library app, the Libby app specifically that works through my library, I could check out digital content. I could check out ebooks for free. So I'm reading A Dance with Dragons right now by George R. R. Martin, book 5 in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I'm checking this out through my library. And same thing with audiobooks. There are a ton of audiobooks that are available through the Libby app through my library. So those are just some advantages I think that go along with having these different formats, with having digital formats. I am starting to collect books, as many of you have seen in your time following my channel probably, and I intend to collect more, but I want to be very purposeful about what I bring to my shelf and the cost. But in the meantime, I feel very privileged to have these different options. And I do want to mention privilege because it is a privilege. I think not everyone is going to have certain privileges when it comes to these things. Not everybody lives within close proximity to a library. So those are things to keep in mind. And not everybody has the privilege to have time in their busy day to read. I don't feel like that gets talked about enough. So just quickly want to mention it. And I would love to hear from you. Have your thoughts changed when it comes to book formats over the years? Or are you open to changing your mind in the future? Has BookTube had any influence on that? I would also be curious to hear that as well. So that is it for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye.